Welcome to the third annual conference, Youth Resiliency, Hate, Racism, and Radicalization. I wanted to take the chance to welcome you and to reiterate OISI's support for the important work that Midaynta does, for Mahad Youssef and his team at Midaynta. OISI's been working with Midaynta since, I think, 2014, roughly 2014, but I think a little bit into 2013 as well. So close to 5 years that we've been engaging with Midaynta and supporting its work. And this was based on the recognition that there's a need for greater collaboration between communities, community agencies, and education researchers in dealing with the many challenges of immigrant settlement and its aftermath, and in particular challenges facing marginalized communities such as those who arrived here fleeing from conflict. So we have been engaging with Midaynta at OISI, various faculty, as well as providing this safe and inclusive space for the important dialogue that's taking place. But we've also supported and been engaged with the 2 previous conferences to this. And we really support and applaud Midaynta's work in terms of settlement services, youth outreach, as well as their implementation of their various projects, including the Rites of Passage, Youth Mentorship Program, and Project Turnaround. And just to conclude then, we are partners with Midaynta at OISI, faculty and OISI as an institution, but we also really support and applaud and want to help nurture the productive collaborative partnerships with Midaynta and other community groups, government agencies here in Canada and abroad. So welcome. I'm looking forward to our conversations. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to be here, to share with you and to listen and to learn also from you on these very, very important topics of youth resiliency, radicalization, racism, discrimination, and hate. These are very topical issues, very current issues, not just for Canada, but for all countries of the world. For me, it's particularly important that these issues are discussed because youth, maybe not in many Western countries, but in Africa, youth is the biggest population of Africa. Kenya, for example, has got almost 70% of its population below the age of 35. And therefore, we consider any issues touching on youth to be extremely important. But what are we doing so that they become so angry? You give them everything, school, everything, but they still feel not welcome, not part of society, to the extent that they become so angry and they want to hurt the same people who facilitated them and trying to, integrate them in their societies. We must look at that. But for me also, as I live, this right extremism, let us not close our eyes. Sometimes we just focus on one side. And again here, the right extremists have taken the same advantage of freedom of expression, freedom of association, to promote discrimination, racism, and violent extremism against.
We do recognize and we must recognize that many diverse and newcomer communities continue to experience barriers to inclusion that must be overcome. And this is a situation that can lead to some youth to be disengaged and to radicalization, as you will discuss today in this conference. So one of the ways that our government believes we can fight disengagement and radicalization is by offering inclusion and opportunity. Our young people should feel that they belong and that anything is possible here in their city, in their country, and that they can live life to their full potential, and that they can expect a bright future.
Who really are our youth that are at risk? So really to go back and examine our presuppositions and to rethink the complexity. To do that, to fight against the increasing social polarization of this space, and to rethink the interface between discrimination, violent radicalization, mental health, and ideological presuppositions. One simple ideological presupposition. In Canada currently, we have a very clear law that prosecutes based on intention to commit a terrorist attack. Intention to. Now, if we start to prosecute every single youth or person who has the intention to do something violent, we're going to prosecute probably everybody. Versus absolute lack of clarity around hate-based violence, hate crimes. There is some work coming on, but I think this should be supported. Absolute lack of clarity around hate crimes, while we know that it's an important risk for violent radicalization.
So there are reasons for alienation, for depression, for hatred. And these, more or less, these are facts, maybe not real news or fake news, I don't know. These are numbers that I've seen, and I've witnessed some of this. And it leads to the spread of hatred, it leads to the spread of conspiracy theories. And I think if we don't acknowledge the situation in our interaction with the communities here, if we don't have some curiosity about what's happening to these, to the communities that some of you are from, I honestly don't think we're going to be able to interact credibly.
People who self-identified as Black, particularly youth, more than half of them feel they don't belong in school, that they don't feel welcome in school. And to the point of academic achievement is one of the strongest predictors of social mobility, and while it's not entirely an insulating factor, certainly it's a pathway to success. If we have half of our population feeling excluded from school, we have a real problem.
At the end of the day, what's going to stop people from wanting to engage in violence for any kind of ideological reason, and even non-ideological reasons, if you want to prevent that in the first instance, is good governance. How do we build resilient communities? Not build resilient communities to stop terrorism. How do we build resilient communities? Because that's what it means to run a functioning society. That's what it means to be able to bring in immigrants, make them feel part of the society, and let the entire society benefit and be uplifted by it. Countering violent extremism is what happens when you fail at preventing violent extremism. Countering violent extremism is going to be focused on individuals. Not individuals who are necessarily engaged in terrorism or necessarily engaged in activity that is itself inherently illegal yet, but are going down a dangerous path. That can be gangs, that can be drugs, that can be violence. Then you will need to actually work at the individual level, and that may be off-ramping, that may be interventions, countering. But where we will always have the biggest bang for our buck, and where we will be doing the greatest service, not only to society, but to the individuals at hand, is in the area of preventing violent extremism, moving the needle as early in the process as possible, and trying to inoculate communities from some of these dangerous ideas, trying to identify what is it in a particular geographic area, for a particular community. There are lots of different ways to think about this that could give people the cognitive opening to dangerous ideas, to ideology.
So let me tell you this. Interview respondents in all 3 cities reported feeling discriminated against for a number of often interrelated reasons, including the neighborhoods in which they live, stereotypical assumptions that Somali people are violent and or they are involved in crime or terrorism, And lots of discrimination reported that was perceived to be on the basis of race and religion, and lots of interconnections among and between each of these individual reasons for discrimination. Common sites and situations where discrimination was experienced included the educational system, the labor market, in public spaces, and at the hands of the police and border officials. Our study participants across the 3 cities had a lot to say about the police and a lot to say about their experiences at the border.
The solution to these problems of radicalization, of terror, of deep-seated, quote-unquote, systemic prejudice and racism is a human-to-human approach. This prejudice is a contagion, and we can actually be the cure of that contagion.
The Hawala sanctions. Hawalas are these companies that wire money from anywhere in the world, and it's been the biggest business for immigrants because it's hiring people, and it was, you know what, a lot of immigrants, when there are crises at home, all of us have left our parents, grandparents, and all that. What we do is we work here very hard to send money. But guess what? We can no longer send money because all the Hawalas, the government of Canada banned and they closed them. So guess what? The mother who is struggling to raise kids has got also a mother who she sends money every month, you know, to take care of her. The mother, how can she raise a resilient child while herself is so weak? She's worried about livelihood of people back home and is worried about the violence in Toronto or in here in home. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with.
In 2006, you'll see that on an ethno-specific basis, the rates of poverty, which is, again, a key visual health, social, economic indicator of disadvantage, of exclusion, of marginalization, you'll see anywhere from most of the people of European or Caucasian or background and heritage are clustered at the bottom, roughly about 1 in 10% on average within those communities. And when you track up across all those different ethno-racial groups, and this is on a province-wide Ontario basis, you'll see the Somali Canadian community at 70% rate of poverty.
There are a number of concrete strategies that we can use in preparing youth to recognize and critically engage with hate when they encounter it online, as well as teaching young people to recognize the common characteristics of ideologies of hate. We can also teach them to recognize and decode the various persuasive techniques which hate groups of all kinds use, such as employing misinformation, denialism, and pseudoscience, building group solidarity through appeals to nationalism or religion, casting themselves and their members in a hero narrative, and of course, portraying their perceived enemies as a dehumanized other.
What social media does for extremist individuals and extremist groups, how they use it, and then what are some of the ways in which governments and others have attempted to address the issue. So one of the main things that they do, one of the main things that social media does, is it allows these individuals and extremist organizations to bypass mainstream media, right? And this is a very kind of old phenomenon. You had the Grand Wizard of the KKK, David Duke, write in 1998 that the internet would, quote, facilitate a worldwide revolution of white awareness. And that similarly, Abu Bakr Naji, who wrote The Management of Savagery, which is a very important book on jihadist strategy, also made the argument that social media is basically allowing these individuals, allowing us, as he put it, to kind of bypass established media platforms and things like that, to talk directly to our supporters and talk directly to people who matter.
To talk about the terminology that we use, just to follow up on some of the comments that were made today, we do not use countering violent extremism. We don't use it because we don't feel like it's the appropriate term to apply to this issue. And we feel like the use of countering violent extremism has both been too broad in its use, and through some initiatives has kind of been tainted in its use as well. So the term that we like to use is countering radicalization to violence. It's more of a preemptive approach. As was mentioned this morning, we are trying to counter people who are radicalizing to violence. We're not countering radicalization. People are free to have the political beliefs that they hold. A lot of those political beliefs that were once seen as radical have been changing. have changed the lives of millions of people, whether it was the right for women to vote here in Canada, whether it was the efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi. People are allowed to be radical. It's when that radicalization puts an individual to the path towards violence is when there is a worry.
Their big issue, the big theme that I have not heard here today yet, was authenticity. The challenge that they have in being authentic online, the pressures against them in terms of developing their authentic selves. And one of the recommendations that they left us with was they want the adult world to take up the cause of authenticity. They want the adult world to be developing hashtags. Their critical thinking skills are really actually quite sophisticated and very high. We need to support them with messages around positive engagement, authenticity, and learning to be yourself in a diverse world, balancing your personal identity and your uniqueness with your larger social identity and your opportunity to contribute.
This conference on youth resiliency, hate, racism, and radicalization has brought together professionals as well as the community and partners from Canada and USA in an open dialogue. Under the roof of discussion, some of the issues facing our nation and to develop possible strategies or solutions on how we can become aware and more engaged on some of the initiatives taking place in our communities.
I traveled to 20 capitals across the Middle East and Europe and beyond. And what I learned is that we don't know very much about radicalization and violent extremism. And this was pretty universal at all of the capitals. And despite well-intended, well-meaning officials, there was so much grappling and groping for information. How do we get at this? One sees across the globe this ascendancy of countering violent extremism. But it has two major interrelated problems and that continue to confound practitioners and policymakers in every single capital. The first is a lack of empirical knowledge about the root causes and drivers of violent extremism. You can't go to a single event on radicalization and violent extremism without hearing about root causes and drivers. But this lacuna has led to conceptual confusion about countering violent extremism. So what does this mean? It is very difficult to design an effective policy when there is little consensus on what does it mean to counter violent extremism or what action should be taken. Consequently, CVE efforts are mostly designed and funded on the basis of anecdotal evidence with unknown results. I've seen this in Yemen, I've seen it in Somalia, I've seen it across Europe, I've seen it in America. And again, it's well-intended, well-meaning folks, oftentimes in capitals, who are fashioning policies that seem great in a place like DC or in London, but might not work so well on the ground. The second problem, and this is with special reference to the US, is the ways in which that the US government has engaged with an entire religious community. It's caused enormous strain. And this is not just the current administration. This goes back to the Obama administration. And this is in part because efforts are not led by youth in the community. Efforts on countering violent extremism are almost entirely led by the Department of Justice, which essentially means that they do outreach to community leaders to try and keep them involved, keep them on side. But the problem with this in the US is that the community rarely, let me be clear on this, the community rarely knows about youth who are radicalized in their midst. Moreover, the vast majority of Muslims do not embrace violent extremism, especially in America. Of the world's jihadi foreign fighter population in the last few years, in the US, only 250 people were mobilized. 3.5 million Muslims in the US, 250 were mobilized. And of that, half of those actually were able to get on a plane and travel. So you're talking about a small number. To put this in perspective, it is 0.0075%. And yet, the government's approach is community engagement, and we'll figure out how to get at this. And the community continues to tell the government, we don't even know who these folks are until they've already mobilized.
It was important for our community because our community has been studied to death some people would say. But what was important was that this study would be different and that it would be coming from the perspectives of the community itself. And someone said in part of our outreach, no study about us without us. So for the Black community to talk and to share its experiences and to be involved in that, to include that, to provide leadership around that, it was critical and it was important. And one of those organizations and those partners that we reached out to initially, we had about 25 collaborating partners, and we also have some other lead partners who provided additional information and resources, including the Y, the United Way, and so on, and you'll see some of the information here, the Diversity Institute as well. We went to Midaynta.
We were just in a really close-knit community, and I think coming to Toronto, my parents wanted to replicate that. They wanted to be in a community where they could be within the Somali-Canadian context. They wanted to be with familiar faces.
Two or three times a week when I walked into the house, I'd be stopped, and they'd ask me, why am I here? I have been a member of parliament at this point for over a year, and they still didn't know who I was. And at one point, I was walking just a few paces behind my male white colleague, and he walked through, and then I walked behind, and they said, are you with them? And I said, no. And then he said, why are you here? That death by 1,000 cuts, it really it drains.
I do want to just touch a little bit too on the kind of nexus between the radicalization to violent extremism, the process, and look, we can't ignore it. The reality is that there are times where it does have an impact. There are times where our kids, our youth do feel that, based on their skin tone and based on their religious affiliation and based on what they believe and what they don't believe, that, they are discriminated against, they are marginalized, they are villainized. And we cannot, I find sometimes just through my experience with working on many of these files, it's almost this kind of, it's almost this broad understanding, oh, terrorism, it's black and white. How would anybody ever go down this pathway? This is unbelievable that somebody would want to, take the life of innocent people in order to, push forward an agenda or talk about this. It's not. It's actually not that. It's actually the more files you get involved in, you realize, it's something that you can only be projected to so much hate and so much bias and so much, villainization, where you actually start to feel that you want to be a part of something. You want to, and it's those susceptibilities that actually make you and that expose you, that make you vulnerable to some of the rhetoric, some of the online recruitment tactics, and they are brilliant at it. And there's many entities that are starting to emulate what some of the groups like Daesh were so successful in adopting and implementing. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see a bit of the far-right movement start to adopt some of those propaganda techniques, and they are having an impact. And just know, that hate and that speech, these are kids. They're, 8, 9, 10 years old. They'll be 15 and 21 day. And at some point, we have to address and we have to be able to talk about this.
In our Toronto Strong Neighborhood strategy, we built it and we designed it with residents. We built it and designed it with the service providers who service them, and we built it and designed it with the funders that fund them. And we brought all of those groups together to develop our strategy and our action plan. And one of the most important things that came out of it, in addition to developing local place-based plans and everything else that you sort of heard, is some major system movement. And so we were tasked by council, because of using resident voice and experience as a city, to develop indicators on systemic or institutionalized racism. And for a municipality to take on a task like that is huge. And the only reason that we were able to do that is because of the voice of residents.
So what we did essentially was try to find actionable recommendations that both the client that we were working for, but also the Alliance of Community Organizations and the Ontario government could quickly implement. And there's a range of different options that or a menu of options that we presented to clients, but I would like to maybe just talk about three. The first, I want to just point out, when we were doing our research, we found very quickly that there are a lot of silos in terms of people knowing professionals knowing and individuals knowing about each other and the work that they do. So we talk to people who would maybe be in BC or in Ohio, who've done tremendous work on ground in Somalia or Ethiopia or Eritrea or Kenya, but they don't know about each other or the work that they've done, and they don't share that knowledge.
We need to look at different methodologies of intervening in the lives of these young people. They have lost confidence, and they have a hopelessness and a veneer that I'm okay, and they're not. Okay, and so we have to in these conferences, which are really good, we have to look at the implementation, and we have to measure the outcomes. We don't measure outcomes. 40 years ago in the Toronto District School Board, young black people were failing. 40 years later, 40% are failing. So you say, well, something's wrong with that picture. We have more black people and people of color in the boards and in different positions in the government than we've ever had before. But collectively, we are worse off. So something is wrong.
Working with the local communities to address the needs of mental health support for youth. Depression, anger, and social isolation will push youth to the radicalization. Support moderate Muslim scholars and secular individuals and groups to stand against the radicalization without fear and intimidation from the radical group, and continue building democratic institutions.
As community workers, if you are a community worker, stakeholders, it's not about being culturally sensitive, it's about being cultural brokers. So with culturally sensitive work, you are trying to understand the culture, you're trying to be sensitive. But with cultural brokering, you are understanding that you yourself, if you are not a member of this community, that you yourself have to be educated about the traumas, the experiences, and the significance of many things within that community. Because how are you to come into a community without understanding the significance of a lot of things within that community, and things that maybe may seem a little ridiculous to you, but that are very fundamental to the community themselves.
In our society and around the world, what some see as radicalization, others would see as awakening, as mobilization, as a good thing, not a bad thing. Even your poet just a few minutes ago before closing the last session, one of her lines was, "Let the revolution begin." Well, by definition, anyone who is looking to revolutionize is also, I think, looking to radicalize conventional thinking about the way society exists.
Someone gets killed, the police investigate it, they initiate hopefully a prosecution to get the matter before courts. Where I work now, that roadmap isn't as clear. I'm dealing with files, along with the members of my team. I represent a team of about 16 people that work in our office. The files that we deal with are much more gray, I like to call it. These are concerns that community members bring forward to the police that may not necessarily be criminal. They are concerns about people watching YouTube videos at the library, people who overhear conversations on the buses, or Crime Stoppers tips about neighbors that they have concerns about. Things that are reported to the police that don't fall into criminality. As we're all aware, the police have authorities to do things within our communities. The authority to arrest people, the authority to pull over cars or stop cars, apprehend people under the Mental Health Act. Very clear, defined authorities which allow us to do things for the betterment of society, and whether we put people in front of the courts or apprehend them, take to the hospital because they're suffering from mental health. The area that I'm working in now, a lot of those authorities don't apply. A person watching a YouTube video about a beheading video or a white supremacist rally or school shootings is not illegal. As offensive as that is, that's not illegal. So what do we do? What can we do? We want them to be, these matters to be reported. We do want the police to respond. We do want services to be activated to support whoever is engaging in this behavior. Because what we're finding is that the people who are engaging in this behavior are quite similar to the same people who are falling into the gang life, the human trafficking life, people who are suffering from aspects of their personal lives that is making them susceptible to risk factors, whether they're marginalized, disenfranchised, feeling as though they don't have a sense of belonging. All of these things are manifesting in many areas that the police are coming across.
One of the things that I would want to highlight is what we've been learning about relationship building. I think it's really crucial for us to start to develop mentorship programs to train people that can actually do intervention, but not intervention in a kind of very contrived way and in a way that signals to young people that they're in trouble, but rather approaches them in ways, creates pathways for them to participate in community life in ways that they feel supported, respected, dignified. So I think there needs to be some kind of more development of mentorship programming. And I think also, I think the amount of literacy, media literacy, and digital literacy work that we've been doing could be amplified and increased.